Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about chapter 1 of Isabel Allende's Eva Luna. So it's a good idea to take notes, to pause and reflect and kind of look back over chapter 1 of the novel as I talk about some of these things, because it'll help to enrich your understanding of what's going on with this text. So I'm going to take it to a share screen so that we can see the PowerPoint that I've created. All right, so this novel is Eva Luna by Isabel Allende. As we find out in chapter 1, we know that Eva Luna's name means life, Eva, and Luna meaning moon, for those of you who are Spanish speakers or speakers of Romance or Latin-based languages. So yeah, life moon. Let's think about that, and we'll talk about a bit more about that in depth as we go. The first slide I want to show you is this type of fiction that's called picaresque fiction. Picaresque fiction is kind of like if you're talking about like horror fiction or science fiction. It's a genre of fiction. It's not as well known technically as some of these other genres. But it's a very interesting genre of fiction, and it has some very key elements that you want to look out for. Eva Luna is an example of picaresque fiction. So the first element is that it's told in the first person, meaning the main character, who is known as the Picaro, usually tells the story from their point of view. Sometimes it will be third person omniscient narrator who's still focusing on that Picaro, but generally it's told in first person. And what is a Picaro? Well, it's essentially the lovable rogue narrator or protagonist of the story. So in this case, clearly the Picaro is Eva Luna. She's, her name's the title of the book. It's episodic in structure, meaning it's kind of like a television show in that like each chapter brings us to a new scenario, perhaps a new setting, usually a new setting, a new element of society that we're introduced to, so that we can kind of get, once we're done with the whole novel, a panoramic view of this society. And also what that means is that certain aspects of each chapter are affected by the chapters that precede them, but not to the extent that a typical sort of like narrative structure novel would. So keep that in mind, right? Picaresque fiction was a precursor and sort of an ancillary to realist fiction. And I know we talked about realist fiction with Samuel Johnson. So to kind of get a little background on this, right? Because we're looking at societies, that's really what picaresque fiction is doing in its episodic nature. It's looking at all these different elements in a given society through the travels of the Picaro, right? We start to see this realistic fiction develop, right? So it's a survey of the various elements in a given society. And its origins are in Spanish literature. And just like Samuel Johnson talks about, kind of responding to heroic or romance literature of the medieval or early Renaissance period, what we're looking at with the picaresque novel is a response to that. So if any of you have ever read Don Quixote, right, the kind of cartoon rendering here on the image on the right, Don Quixote is probably the most famous example of picaresque fiction, where you have Don Quixote, right, who's kind of going through these various stages, these various episodes where he encounters different places and different people in Spanish society. It's comical, right? It's sort of exaggerated in a lot of ways. And so one of the reasons why Cervantes was writing Don Quixote, right, was this same sort of like mocking response to that heroic romantic literature of the Renaissance, right? So that's a great example of picaresque fiction. Another one that's a little more recent and a little closer to home would be Mark Twain's Huck Finn, the one on the left here. So if if any of you had to read Huck Finn in high school or college, it tells the story of a boy who essentially travels up the Mississippi River, right? So he's seeing these various elements of society in the American South. He has these sort of episodic adventures. He's definitely a lovable rogue, right? So those are two main examples of picaresque fiction, Eva Luna being another one. So who wrote Eva Luna? Isabel Allende. Let's know a little bit about her, just enough to kind of get us, get the ball rolling. You're more than welcome to do more biographical research as we go, or, in preparation for the final essay. But some things that like we should know right out the gate is that like she's female. She was born in Chile, but she moved to America and has dual citizenship. So she's not like Chilean American and that like her parents are Chilean and she was born here. No, she was born in Chile. But because of a lot of political unrest and her family being a political family, she was exiled and she's kind of lived in America for a very long time. Elements of her literature, if anyone's read any Isabel Allende, you'll see a lot of magic realism, which is realistic fiction, but it's overlaid with elements of fantasy and myth. So it's not fully like a fantasy novel, right, where everything is fantastical, right? It's not realistic. But it's also not like teacup realism, what they call, which is like, the very like sort of Arthur Miller, Willy Loman kind of like stark realism, right? It's somewhere where we are infusing reality and realism with fantastical and mythical elements. So if anyone's read any Jorge Luis Borges, right, or any Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right, like this is stuff that is in the same wheelhouse as that. In terms of historical elements, Isabel Allende is a niece of Salvador Allende. And if you don't know who Salvador Allende is, Salvador Allende was the leader of Chile, but he was actually ousted and murdered in a military coup by Agustin Pinochet. And that coup was actually backed by the US government. So some of these democratic missions that we've had in other countries, not so democratic. We actually deposed Allende, killed him, and inserted a dictatorial government, helped to insert a dictatorial government in its place. And that was the Pinochet government. So Agustin Pinochet, as it says, was a dictator. He usurped Allende's democratic rule through military force. Allende ended up dying. And much of the Allende family, including Isabel Allende, had to flee to various parts of the Americas. Some settled in Mexico. Again, some settled in the United States. But a lot of political upheaval. So as you're reading chapter 1 and you see like the student protests, you have to pay attention to that kind of stuff. There's a lot of discussion in chapter 1 about politics, and you may be kind of hearing that in the back of your mind going, what's all this discussion with politics? Well, keep in mind that Allende is someone who is very like politically aware of where she's coming from. And even though the country in this novel is not mentioned, it's sort of, ambiguous South American nation, South American Spanish colonial nation. We definitely still see a lot of these ties, right? A lot of these parallels. So for dramatic plot, we have a direction of a play's plot. And I know we just finished M Butterfly, right? So if you want to think about this in terms of M Butterfly and then kind of segue to your understanding of Eva Luna, this is really going to help, okay? So most drama and narrative includes the following sequence of events. First, you have the exposition right here. where we expose to the audience the characters, the setting, the historical background, the backdrop, right? The initial actions that get things in motion, right? That's the exposition. So the writer is literally exposing us to these things. And one thing I want to say about writers, if you've never taken a literature class before, or if this has never been mentioned in a literature class before, everything on the page, whether it's a book, a novel, whether it's a short story, a poem, every single word is deliberate and was sweated over and was edited and revised and reread and taken with the most care and caution. And you may look at books that are like this, 200 to 300 pages. You may look at even longer books that are 1,000 pages, and you may go, wow, that's a lot of sweating, right? Yeah, it's a lot of work. That's why it takes people a long time to write books. And so if every single word that the writer is putting into this novel is deliberate, that means that Allende is crafting Eva Luna with a very specific idea in mind, right? With deliberate intentions in mind. It may not be the sort of like 1-to-1 ratio, like she writes this and it has to mean that, but she's trying to get an overall impression from her readers, right? And she's trying to share her thoughts in a way that is authentic to her writing process, okay? So where we are now in chapter 1 is we are in the exposition. We're being introduced to characters and setting. At some point, you'll see a catalyzing event, right? That puts the narrative events in motion, which leads to rising action and conflict, which generally lead to a climax, which is the most exciting, or really what the climax is the point of no return, right? It's where something happens in the story where once it happens, we can't go back to the way things were before. So people will say it's like the most exciting part, but it's the way to think about the climax is the point of no return. Then we have, after the climax, the falling action that is leading us to the end of the story. In the end of the story, we have the resolution and the denouement. The resolution is where what can be resolved is resolved, or if it can't be resolved, it's sort of agreed upon amongst the universe in that novel, right? In that play, in that work of fiction, that it can't be, for whatever reason, right? And then the denouement, this is a French word. It's not denouement, it's denouement. That is a sort of reflection on the resolution, either by the protagonist, either by the third person omniscient narrator. Sometimes it's like written in epistolary form, where you have like a note, right, that someone found in like a bottle in the sea or something. But it resolves or reflects on kind of the ending, right? So if anyone's ever read like The Handmaid's Tale, there's a really famous denouement in The Handmaid's Tale where at the very end of the novel, you don't know what's going to happen to the handmaid, but then you get the denouement, and I'm not like giving anything away here, but you get the denouement, which is like a century later, in an academic conference where they've like found the handmaid's letters and are discussing them, right? So and then they have stuff to say about that, right? So that would be a good example of denouement. So since setting is such an important part of exposition, let's talk about it. Setting is the time and place in which a narrative occurs. And again, when we're talking about picaresque fiction, when we're talking about magic realism, we're talking about events that are fictional, but they're definitely reflective of real life events, right? So like the Pinochet coup, right, would be a very clear and direct sort of discussion that we could contextualize this story with. Again, a Spanish colonial Latin American country that at one point in the mid 20th century experienced a dictatorship. Well, there's a handful of those, right? So that historical context could serve us well, right? But also, so we have time and place. Setting can occur in the physical sense and also in the the non-physical or the metaphysical sense. Okay, so again, when Eva Luna is talking about like the ghosts in Professor Jones's um in his laboratory in his home, right? Those are aspects of the setting that are metaphysical, right? When you go into a character's sort of internal monologue and they're talking about their feelings and their perceptions and their ideas, that could be a sort of non-physical setting, right? Their thoughts or things. Um, setting contributes to other literary elements. So think about like the plot. If anyone's seen the film Parasite, and that's the image from behind here, if you think about like the rain, and if you haven't seen Parasite, please watch it. It is best movie of 2019. Midsummer, close second, but Parasite, fantastic film. Can't recommend it enough. Brilliant film. So if you've seen Parasite, there's this very famous, I guess, there's this very pivotal, I guess I would say, scene in which there is a rainstorm. And that rainstorm contributes to the climax of the film, right? The point of no return. And it contributes to the characters being put in a situation where they have to make decisions that lead to that climax, right? So that would be a great, that sort of physical event, that geographical event, right, would be a great example of how it affects plot. The mood, right? If you've ever seen Teletubbies, if you look at the setting of Teletubbies, you have like the green rolling hill and the natural green home and the happy little baby that's in the sun and, the bright day and the fluffy clouds, right? That's going to contribute to the mood of that show, right? We're not talking about like nihilistic existentialism in the Teletubbies. It's happy, it's simple, it's for little kids, it's to make them feel better, right? So that's where a setting would affect mood. Setting can also affect a character or characters' emotional or psychological states, right? If I know most people are probably not familiar with this song, but there's an old Boomtown Rats song called I Don't Like Mondays. And it's based off of this actual story that happened where a woman drove her car into a preschool and killed a bunch of children. And they asked her the reason why she did that. And she said, I don't like Mondays. So, if you're a beginning of the week hater, right, then that day, right, that time could set you off, and then that could, affect plot and things like that. So keep setting in mind because it's important, and it's a big part of the exposition of Eva Luna in chapter 1. Also pay attention to, like I said, pay attention to characters. Every single thing that a writer puts on the page, especially if it's published and wins awards and that writer has, the appeal to ethos and that like they're a well-known writer for clear and obvious reasons. Everything in there's going to be deliberate, right? So the characters in Eva Luna, who are they? What are they like? What do they look like? What is striking about Eva Luna? What do we know about her background? That's another big thing in picaresque fiction is the picaro. The picaro comes from unknown origins, right? So doesn't have like a huge chart of their family tree or anything. What about Professor Jones? What about Consuelo, right? What about the gardener, right? So think about these characters and not only what they look like, but how they behave, what images or symbols we associate with them, and why the writer might put them into this novel, right? I already mentioned the historical context and the sort of mentioning of historical events or the alluding to historical events. So keep an eye on that because that's going to play a major role in this novel, particularly as they pertain to politics. Politics is going to play a big role in this novel, so pay attention to that. And what you always do with literature is like those images, those things you can see in your mind as you're reading that stick out to you, that are striking, and those strong lines. One of the reasons I became an English major was because I was such a music nerd and I loved kind of pulling out lines from songs. And I thought I was really deep, when I was all of 16 years old and, quoting Elvis Costello or whatever. Um, I was about as deep as toilet water, just so you all know, in case there was any confusion about that whatsoever. But those sort of lines that stick with you, that mean something, that affect you, right? Those are important. And again, writers put those in deliberately and think a lot about them and how they're going to have that effect. So pay attention to those, not just in chapter 1, but as we go through the novel, right? And that's about it for the beginning of Eva Luna. I will have the discussion board post up, so keep an eye out for that. And if I'll take it off share screen, if questions come up about the novel, please let me know as soon as possible. From previous classes, I've had a lot of students, and particularly students who don't typically like to read a lot, I've had them tell me that they really enjoyed this novel. So I hope you do too. I hope it's meaningful for you. I hope it's fun and interesting. But if you get stuck, no worries, right? Not every book is for everyone. So just hit me up if that's the case. All right, well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all in cyberspace. Bye.